T-shaped pillars of limestone, 10 tons each, raised on a hilltop in southern Turkey 11,500 years ago. No metal, no writing, no wheel, a thing that should not exist. And then, stranger still, it was gone. Not toppled, not burned, buried. Sealed under tons of earth, the great stones packed in and left to the dark, and for years the story was tidy. The builders entombed their own temple and walked into oblivion. A people who rose, raised something impossible, and then simply vanished. Then the science came back, and almost none of it held. They did not vanish. The earth that swallowed the place may never have been their doing, and where they actually went is written, even now, in the blood of half a continent. To understand what everyone got wrong, you have to start with the day the hill finally gave the place back. When the first excavators cut into that hill in the 1990s, they found the pillars standing exactly where they had been raised, upright, intact. Their carvings sharp as the day they were cut. And that, more than anything, was the strange part. Stone left in the open for 11,000 years does not survive like that. It falls. It weathers. It scatters. These had been preserved because something had packed them in earth and held them there, sealed away from the wind and the rain and the slow erasure of time. The man who understood what he was looking at was a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. He recognized the importance of the site in 1994, began digging in earnest the following year, and directed the work until his death in 2014. What he uncovered did not fit anywhere in the accepted story of human beginnings. The site sits in the Sanliurfa region of southern Turkey, and its oldest layers reach back roughly 11,500 years. To hold that number still for a moment, consider what came after it. Stonehenge would not be raised for another 6,000 years. The pyramids of Giza, later still. The people who built this place were working before the wheel, before writing, before pottery had been invented in this part of the world, before metal of any kind. And yet they quarried limestone pillars as tall as 3 men, weighing as much as 10 tons, stood them upright in great rings, and carved their surfaces with foxes and vultures and scorpions and wild boar and coiling snakes, rendered with a confidence that took generations of accumulated skill to reach. These were not crude scratchings. This was art, made by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The place was named Göbekli Tepe, and it was honored as something the world had never seen. In 2018, it became a World Heritage Site. Yet for all the attention, only a fraction of it has ever been touched. Roughly 1/10 has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar, reading the hill without breaking it, suggests at least 20 more great enclosures still lie beneath the surface, waiting. What we have seen is the smallest sample of what is actually there. For 1,000 years and more, this hilltop drew people to it. They came and they raised their pillars and they carved their animals into the stone, generation after generation, across a span longer than the entire history that separates us from the fall of Rome. And then, around 10,000 years ago, it stopped. The buildings ceased, the gatherings ended, and the great stones, the foxes and the vultures, and the towering T-shaped figures were swallowed by the earth and left behind. The hill closed over them like a wound healing shut, and the place that should never have existed slipped out of the world entirely, remembered by no one, until a plow in the soil and a few curious men brought it back. That was the mystery as it stood for years. A people who built something impossibly ahead of their time, who sustained it for 1,000 years, and who then, for reasons no one could name, buried it and were gone. It was a clean story, a rise, a wonder, a vanishing. There was only one problem with it. The word everyone reached for to explain that ending was deliberate. They buried it on purpose, the story said. And deliberate is the very first thing the new excavations took apart. Schmidt had an answer, and it was a haunting one. He believed the people of Göbekli Tepe had buried their temple on purpose, not abandoned it, entombed it. He pictured a deliberate act of closing, the great enclosures packed with rubble and earth by the very hands that had raised them, the buildings laid to rest the way a body is laid to rest. It was a beautiful idea. It explained the impossible preservation. It gave the ending a meaning, a ritual, a sense that these people had chosen the silence rather than simply suffering it. And for a long time, it was the story the world accepted. Then the people who came after Schmidt looked again. After his death, the German Archaeological Institute kept digging, and the work fell to a team led by the archaeologist Lee Clare, alongside the architect Moritz Kinzel. In 2017, when a protective canopy was being raised over the site, the supports had to be sunk deep into the ground, and that gave the researchers a rare chance to cut straight down through the oldest, lowest layers, like keyhole surgery into the heart of the mound. What they found in those deep soundings did not look like a ceremony. It looked like an accident. The fill, they argued, was not carried in and packed deliberately at all. It was sediment. Earth and rubble that had slid down from the higher parts of the hill over time, washed and tumbled into the enclosures by erosion and by landslides. And there was evidence for exactly that. One severe slope failure had poured debris into the great enclosure known as Enclosure D, burying it under the wreckage of structures further up the slope. Later, around the closing centuries of the 9th millennium before the present era, another major collapse came down, and this one, many now believe, was the blow that finally drove people to leave. The hill had not been sealed by reverence. It had been buried by its own unstable ground. It is important to be honest here, because the question is not fully closed, and good science says so plainly. A minority of researchers still hold that the older view has weight. They point to the sheer volume of material that covered the site. More than a wandering hillside seems likely to supply, and to the pillars themselves, which stand undisturbed and upright, not knocked flat and scattered as a violent landslide might leave them. That stability, they argue, looks more like careful filling than chaotic collapse. The debate is real, and it is ongoing, and anyone who tells you it is settled is telling you more than the evidence allows. And there is one more limit worth stating, because it shapes everything that follows. We cannot simply ask the bodies. At Göbekli Tepe, the human bone that survives is too fragmented and too poorly preserved to give up reliable, ancient DNA. The collagen is gone. The genetic record, here, is silent. So the argument over how this place ended must be fought with sediment and stone and the angle of fallen earth, not with the genomes of the people who knelt in these rooms. The buildings can be read. Their builders cannot, at least not from this hill. But the burial, however it happened, was only the death of the buildings. Stone closing over stone. The title asks a different question, a larger one, about the people. Where did they go? And before anyone could follow them, science had to clear away the crowd of phantoms that others had already conjured to take their place. Before science could answer the question, imagination answered it first. And imagination, faced with something it cannot easily explain, is endlessly inventive. Almost as soon as Göbekli Tepe became known to the wider world, the theories arrived, and they shared a single starting point. The place was too vast, too precise, too old. Ordinary people could not have done this. Something greater must have been behind it. From that one assumption, an entire crowd of explanations was born. Some reached for the Anunnaki, the old gods of Sumerian myth, recast by certain modern writers as visitors from the stars who handed early humans a knowledge they could not have earned alone. Others pointed to the watchers described in the Book of Enoch, a fallen order of celestial beings said to have taught humanity forbidden arts. One author tied the hill directly to the Garden of Eden, though it is worth noting, gently, that the scriptures say nothing whatever about Adam and Eve quarrying limestone and raising megaliths. These are modern readings laid over ancient texts, not the texts themselves, and the evidence in the ground has never required any of them. Then there is the most seductive theory of all, the lost civilization. The writer Graham Hancock and others have argued that an advanced culture, technologically gifted and now completely vanished, stood behind sites like this one, wiped from the earth by a comet strike around 13,000 years ago, that triggered a brutal cold snap and left only these monuments as its ghostly signature. Two researchers went further still, reading one of the carved pillars, the so-called vulture stone, as an astronomical chart recording the precise date of that cosmic disaster. The trouble is that such a reading asks the builders to have mapped the very same constellations that Greek astronomers would not invent for another 9,000 years. It is, to put it kindly, an extraordinary stretch. Strip these stories down, every one of them, and beneath the surface they share a single, buried claim: that the people of the ancient Near East, the actual human beings who lived and worked and died in this region 11,000 years ago, were simply not capable of this, not clever enough, not organized enough, not enough. The assumption has deep roots. It grew out of a 19th century way of thinking, the idea that prehistory meant primitiveness, that people without writing or metal were something closer to animals than to us. It is a condescending view, and it is wrong. That is the quiet flaw running under all of it. The lost civilization, the fallen gods, the visitors from the sky, the drowned masters of a vanished age. Every version requires the same thing: an outside hand, a rescue, the belief that the stones could never have risen without help from somewhere beyond these ordinary people. And for years, while the bodies stayed silent and the genetics had not yet arrived, there was just enough room in the dark for those phantoms to live. But the archaeological record, read honestly and in full, was already telling a different story, one that needed no rescuers at all. The sickle blades in the soil, the grinding stones, the bones of managed animals, the signs of people standing at the very threshold of farming, doing the hard, slow work themselves. And then the science everyone had been waiting for finally came. Researchers learned to pull genetic material from bones thousands of years old, and the past began to speak in a language no myth could argue with. The moment it spoke, every phantom dissolved, and a real, traceable people stepped out of the dark. We have to be honest about where this evidence comes from, because the answer did not rise from Göbekli Tepe itself. The bones on that hill, as we have seen, are too far gone to read. But Göbekli Tepe did not stand alone in an empty land. It sat inside a wider world of people, and across that world, at other sites, the dead were better preserved. From them, the genetic record could finally be pulled. And it is from that broader Anatolian record, not from the Temple Hill directly, that the builder's true story emerges. The oldest thread reaches back further than the pillars themselves. From a place called Pınarbasi in central Anatolia came the remains of a single hunter who lived roughly 13,500 years ago, 2,000 years before the first stone was raised at Göbekli Tepe. His genome, sequenced and published in 2019, gave researchers something precious: a baseline, a reading of who already lived in this land before farming, before monuments, before any of it began. And then they followed that signature forward through the early farming villages that came after: Asikli Hoyuk, Bonkuklu, Katel Hoyuk, Bartin. The genetic line could be traced generation after generation across thousands of years. What it revealed dismantled the lost civilization argument completely, and on the argument's own terms. The farmers of Anatolia, the population from which the builders descended, drew the overwhelming majority of their ancestry, something like 80 to 90% of it, from the local hunter-gatherers who had lived in that same region for ages before them. The farming was not delivered by outsiders. It was developed in place, slowly, by the people who were already there. There was no influx of mysterious strangers, no founding race arriving with gifts of knowledge, no ghost population threaded into the bloodline at the moment the monuments rose. And this is the part that matters most, because the fringe theories made a testable promise without realizing it. If some advanced outside people really had swept in to teach these builders, that contact would have left a mark. A genetic fingerprint. An anomalous strand of ancestry that did not belong, appearing exactly when the great work began. The DNA was searched for precisely that signal. It is not there. No hidden founders, no outside hand. The absence is not a gap in the evidence. It is the evidence. The people who raised Göbekli Tepe were the deep-rooted descendants of people who had farmed and hunted that country for thousands of years. The work was published in the most demanding journals in the field, in Nature and in Science Advances, and supported by a wide body of research across Anatolia, the Levant, and the Zagros Mountains, the arc of land cradling the Fertile Crescent. That research showed something else worth holding on to. These were not one undifferentiated mass of primitive people. They were distinct communities, genetically separate, with deep and separate histories, developing side by side across the same broad landscape, specific, identifiable, human in every measurable way. Because that is what the genome finally confirmed. Not a mystical people, not a supernatural one. Fully modern human beings, cognitively and biologically identical to anyone alive today, carrying the same minds that crossed open ocean in small boats and brought down mammoths on the frozen plains. The same minds that looked at a bare hilltop and saw a temple waiting inside the stone. But the very genome that proved no one came in to build this place revealed something stranger still. Because these people did not stay on their hill. And the question was no longer who came to them. It was where they went. They went west, and they did not go quietly into history. They went carrying everything they were. The Anatolian farmer lineage, the genetic population centered on this region of southern Turkey, did not raise its pillars and fade from the earth. As farming spread across the following thousands of years, these people moved with it, and their movement reshaped a continent. By around 9,000 years ago, they had crossed into Thrace, the corner of land where Anatolia meets Europe. From there, between roughly 8,500 and 6,000 years ago, they poured outward along two great paths. One ran up through the Balkans into the heart of Europe. The other followed the Mediterranean coastline westward, village by village, shore by shore. And where they went, they did not simply visit, they transformed. Across most of the regions they entered, the incoming farmers replaced somewhere between 70 and 100% of the ancestry that had been there before. The hunter-gatherers who had held Europe for tens of thousands of years were, in the genetic record, largely succeeded by the descendants of these Anatolian farmers. This was one of the largest demographic transformations in the entire human story, and it began among the same people who had once gathered on a hilltop to raise stone. That ancestry is not a thing of the distant past. It is alive right now, in the bodies of people reading and watching today. Early European farmer ancestry, as researchers call it, runs through essentially every European population on Earth. It is found at its very highest concentrations in the people of Sardinia and among the Basques of northern Spain and southwestern France, who carry that ancient farming heritage more purely than almost anyone. And it reaches beyond Europe entirely, into Western Asia and across North Africa. The people who built Göbekli Tepe, who managed wild sheep and harvested wild grain and stood T-shaped pillars against the sky without metal or the wheel, are quite literally among the ancestors of a vast share of humanity alive today. Their story did not end on the hill. It traveled the world. So the vanishing was never a vanishing at all. It was a migration and a transformation written into the blood of a continent. But there is a second half to the answer, and it explains why the hill itself fell quiet. Because the way of life that needed Göbekli Tepe was passing. As farming matured and people settled into permanent villages of their own, the great seasonal gathering, the long journey to a shared and sacred place, began to lose its purpose. You do not need to travel to a distant monument to hold a community together when your community already lives around you, in fields and houses, year-round. And here is the proof that this was a tide and not a tragedy. Göbekli Tepe was never alone. Recent work under the Turkish project known as Tas Tepeler, the Stone Hills, led by the archaeologist Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, has revealed that it stood among a whole network of related sites, perhaps a dozen of them, scattered across the region. Karahan Tepe, Sayburk, others still emerging from the ground. And across that entire network, the same thing happened around the same broad span of time. The building wound down, the monuments fell silent. Not one site struck by one disaster, but a whole way of living quietly closing across a landscape, all at once. Which leaves us with the real reason the builders vanished. And it is the strangest answer of all, the one the old textbooks were least prepared to hear. The real reason is that the builders never vanished at all. The word itself was the mistake. What looked from the outside like a people swallowed by the earth was actually three things happening together, none of them a disappearance, and all of them braided into one event that the old story could not read. The first was the burial of the buildings. The great enclosures went under, sealed by deliberate hands or by the slow slide of an unstable hillside, a question still genuinely argued in the field. Either way, what was lost there was stone, architecture. The buildings died. The people did not. The second was the quiet ending of a way of life. The gathering place way of living, the long pilgrimage to a shared and sacred hill, was made obsolete by the very thing these people were inventing: farming. As the fields spread and the villages took root, the reason to journey to Göbekli Tepe simply dissolved. They did not abandon their monuments in despair. They outgrew them. They no longer needed the hill because they had built something new to stand in its place all around them every day of the year. And the third was the migration. The people themselves walked outward across thousands of years and became the ancestors of a continent, their blood still moving through a great share of humanity right now. They did not end. They multiplied. They spread further than they could ever have imagined from that hilltop. Put those three together, and the vanishing turns inside out. It was never a mystery of where a lost people went. It was a transformation so large and so slow that the outsiders who came later, looking only at empty stone, mistook a beginning for an ending. They saw a buried temple and called it a tomb. It was a doorway. The very same error the world made for so long with the people of the American Southwest, naming a migration a disappearance because no one thought to follow where the living had gone. And this is where Klaus Schmidt, gone now for more than a decade, earns a final word. His most daring idea was that the temple came before the farm, that the impulse to gather, to build something sacred and shared and larger than any single life, may have come first, and may have been the very thing that drove these people toward agriculture in the first place. For years that was a provocation, a beautiful guess. But the genetics give it unexpected weight. The DNA shows communities already complex, already coordinated, already capable of vast shared labor before farming was fully theirs. The social bond came first. The farm followed. It remains an interpretation, still debated, but it is one the evidence now leans toward rather than away from. None of it required gods. None of it required visitors from the stars or masters of a drowned and forgotten world. The genome is unambiguous on that point. There is no hidden signal, no rescuing hand, no ghost in the blood. There is only a community of fully modern human beings standing at the single most important hinge in the human story, doing what our kind has always done when faced with the vastness of being alive. They reached upward. They built something to outlast them, and it did outlast them in a way they could never have known. Not only in the stone the hill swallowed and kept, but in us, in the living. The earth held onto the pillars. It could never hold onto the people. T-shaped pillars of limestone, 10 tons each, raised on a hilltop in southern Turkey 11,500 years ago. No metal, no writing, no wheel. The impossible hill, and the earth that closed over it. For years that silence was the whole story. The lost builders, the buried temple, the people who rose and vanished. Then the science came back, and it took the story apart, one piece at a time. Not a tomb sealed shut by a vanished people, but a place abandoned, perhaps reclaimed by its own crumbling slope. Not the work of gods, but of deep-rooted human beings who had farmed that country for thousands of years. Not a disappearance, but a spread into the ancestry of a continent. They only vanished from a story that was never ready to follow where they went. The hill kept the stones. It could not keep the people. We cover the cases history got wrong.